Recently, I was looking to book a cruise, so I looked over all the fares and the ticket prices across the different grades of cabin, and like any normal person, I thought, how does this compare against the Titanic? We know that the ship was touted as the most luxurious ship ever built at the time, maybe with a little bit of exaggeration, but what did passengers actually pay to travel on her? Well, I did some reading, and wow, the results are maybe not quite what you'd expect. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today, let's take a look at the pricing for all the different cabins on board Titanic and figure out what one you would choose to sail in. We all know Titanic was split between first, second, and third class. But what you might not know is that the classes were themselves split between different grades of cabin in the same way that cruise ships are today. What we're going to do is start at the very bottom in the most dirt-cheap third-class cabin and work our way up to the most splendid first-class suite on board and see how much it costs in today's money and what you could expect to get out of it. And we'll even compare the pricing against the last ocean liner in service today, the Queen Mary II, on one of her transatlantic crossings. Now, before we begin, here's some quick context and a very interesting little bit of history. Back then, the travel network was very impressive for the time, and passengers would book their tickets, which often included the actual journey to the docks where Titanic was departing from. The fares were represented by two rates: the inland rate, which included your rail journey from a given destination, and the ocean rate, which literally only covered the ship's time at sea from point of departure to New York. Let's talk about third class. Now, unfortunately, just like second class, we don't yet have the actual pricing for all the individual cabins, but we do have advertised prices from different departure points. This was really handy for people back then, because for the working poor and hopeful immigrants, the prospect of travelling from Glasgow all the way down to Southampton would have been pretty intimidating. The White Star Line teamed up with British rail companies like the London and South Western Railway to run boat trains, basically right to the dockside, and it was all included in the price of your ticket. It was very clever. A few years ago, I took a P&O cruise from Southampton, but I had to get there myself. They just don't run boat trains anymore. And it ended in an Uber ride to the ship itself because Southampton Station is a good distance from the docks. Things have definitely changed. Third class's cabins were spread among the lower decks, and, aside from a few small ones at the very stern of the ship, they didn't go any higher than E-deck. So these were right down in the bowels of the ship, surrounded by cargo hatches, crew accommodations, storage, and other utilitarian spaces. The very stern was usually reserved for third class mainly because of the vibration of the propellers directly below and the groaning of the steering engine as it swung the ship's rudder. There was a surprising spread of cabins in third class, and many were big dormitory-style cabins with bunks for 6, 8, or even 10 people. Back then, steerage accommodation had been very communal. Single male travellers wouldn't get their own cabin, they'd need to share with a group of others. In fact, ships not much older than Titanic, like the Carpathia, had featured enormous dormitories for basically all the third-class passengers, and some of those spaces could be converted into spaces for housing cattle instead. No kidding. So Titanic's third-class cabins like these were a big step up. Aside from the large dormitories forward for male travellers, there were smaller cabins aft, including little two-person sleepers or larger four-berth rooms for families. You'd have a small wash basin, but these weren't plumbed in or anything, they used tanks that could be refilled daily. You'd also get a little folding chair, but that's about it. What you wouldn't get is privacy. The rooms were little more than cubicles, separated by wooden partitions that were open at the very top for ventilation. If you so much as sneezed in the middle of the night, the entire deck might hear you. Of course, you got access to all the public rooms, like the smoking and the general room, and your own hearty fare in the dining saloon. Now, to travel in third aboard Titanic, you'd be looking at a fare of about £8 from London to Southampton and then on to New York. That's about £814 today, or just over $1,000 US. But this fare varied a lot because, remember, it also included your rail journey to actually get to the ship. If you were coming from further afield, you would be paying more. So some coming from continental Europe paid as much as £9. That's £926 or $1,200 US in 2026. It's not as cheap as you might have expected, right? Back then, the average worker's wage was about £1 per week. Coal miners earned just 8 shillings and 5 pence per week, a tragic £36 in 2026 money. That's sometimes what it feels like a pint costs in London. So families clearly had to save up for a long time to actually board a ship like Titanic because they were supposed to be travelling with the best, and they paid for it. Now let's compare this with a transatlantic crossing today. It's hard to do because, of course, they aren't running migration schemes across the Atlantic like they were in 1912, and the ships aren't segregated in the same way as they were back then. But the world's last operating ocean liner, Queen Mary II, is actually class segregated, with cabins split between 3 distinct tiers, from the Britannia class to the Princess and then the Queen's Grill class above, each with its own lounge and a segregated dining saloon. We'll compare against the most basic level of cabin aboard Queen Mary II, a Britannia inside stateroom. The fares for these are set at £943 British, or about $1,200 US. You don't get a window, but crucially, unlike Titanic's day, you do get your own ensuite bathroom, which, as you'll see shortly, was considered a massive luxury in 1912. In all of Titanic's classes, almost everybody had to share communal facilities instead. Of course, on Queen Mary II, the cabins are fully carpeted and beautifully kitted out. On Titanic, in third, you'd have had to put up with bare piping on the roof, a single dim electric globe, and basically no privacy at all. Modern-day insulation means that noise dampening on Queen Mary II is very impressive, and you finally have some privacy to yourself, even if you're staying in this lower grade of cabin. Now on to second class. This was a class mostly made up of clerks, mid-level businessmen, bankers, and middle-class families. They were an educated bunch, and they had high expectations for a ship like Titanic. Famously, the White Star Line and companies like that would tout the old cliché that to travel in second class aboard their newest ship was like travelling in first aboard their older ones, and that rang mostly true for Titanic. Prices were around £12 or £13. That's about £1,300 today. You'd have a fairly comfortable panelled stateroom with a wooden bunk and more soft furnishings. The cabins were again mostly situated lower down, around E, D and C decks, but they weren't styled like the third-class dormitories. These could sleep 2 or 4 people, the latter for families, and they were fairly comfortable. Of course, even though the cabins weren't physically much bigger, and were only really nicer because of their furnishings and panelling detail, your fare brought you a much nicer dining menu and access to the far superior public rooms, including a smoking room, the library, and the impressive promenade way up high on the ship's boat deck. Second-class passengers even got their own elevator to get all the way up there. Queen Mary II's second-class equivalent is actually kind of difficult to judge. There are cabins in Britannia class that are similar in spirit to Titanic's second, like the sheltered balcony cabins, which run about $2,800 or £2,100. But Queen Mary II has its own intermediate class in the Princess Grill cabins. Really, the ship's amenities are so lovely that Princess Grill and the Queen's Grill are something more like first and then super first classes. The Princess Grill cabin on Queen Mary II starts at £3,400. That's $4,600. That gets you access to the Princess Grill's dedicated lounge and their own dining room. But of course, Titanic was famous for its luxury, and most of it could be found up in first class. Fortunately, thanks to surviving documentation from booking agents at the time, this is the class that is the most well documented. But it's also staggering in its variety, and you'll notice that there were many different grades of first-class cabin, all for a large variety of different costs. Most simple of all were the basic cabins down low on E-deck. These started at £27. That's £2,700 today, or $3,600. The cabins weren't much better than the second-class staterooms we just talked about. In fact, many of them were second-class staterooms that could be gated off from that class and then switched over to first instead. For this grade of cabin, it wasn't so much about the accommodation, but the access to the magnificent first-class interiors which occupied so much of the upper decks. The famous public spaces like the smoking room, the lounge, the cafes, that sprawling grand staircase. But if it seems expensive for what is ultimately a fairly basic cabin, then you wouldn't be alone in thinking so. One lady passenger famously complained about the state of her cabin once she had boarded, and she demanded to be upgraded immediately. Up on D-deck, you'd get a similar grade of cabin, but, of course, you'd be one deck higher to the action. And crucially, the cabins up here included big pivoting portholes, which could be swung halfway open to draw fresh air in and ventilate the cabin. If you wanted a room with a porthole like that, it would set you back £50. That's £5,000 today, $6,800 US. But that's just for you. If you wanted to bring a loved one, it would be £30 each. That's about $1,300 US in 2026. But if you wanted a room without a porthole, that's no sweat, it would be $1,000 cheaper. Now that is impressively expensive, but don't worry, there are still 4 decks to go and things get much pricier from here. C-Deck had some of the nicest rooms on board, with heavy wooden panelling and details, some quite large, with their own bathrooms. They were themed on different periods, ranging from Georgian to Louis XIV through XVI, Italian Renaissance, and Adam style. Now this is where the pricing begins to vary considerably, because there were different grades of cabin up here, and some could be joined by unlocking doors and they could be turned into suites. If you wanted a stock standard C-Deck cabin with a pivoting porthole like those on D-Deck, you'd be looking at £70. And that's £7,100 today, or $9,500 US. But what if you wanted your own bathroom? Well, you could say goodbye to £90. That's over $12,000 in 2026. The equivalent to these on Queen Mary 2 might be the standard Queen's Grill suites, which run about $13,000 US today, with their own bathrooms too, of course, although much larger than cabins on Titanic at no less than 506 square feet. That's another major difference between rooms today and back then. Today's passenger expects much more space, and since ships are much bigger anyway, designers are happy to oblige. But C-Deck also had a selection of specialty rooms, the parlour suites, decorated in some of the most lovely styling on board, a Regency, mahogany and gilt-panelled sitting room, an Empire-style white and gold bedroom, a bathroom, and a second, modern-styled bedroom. This spread of rooms could be yours for just £250, with £10 extra for each added person. That is an eye-watering £25,400 today, $34,200 US. This is roughly equivalent to Queen Mary 2's Grand Suites, which run about $24,000 US today, complete with their own lounge and separate bedroom as well. On B-Deck, you had some more fine cabins on board. They were similar in layout to the C-Deck cabins below. For a cabin with a private bathroom, you'd be looking at something like £10 more than C-Deck. That's £100 or £10,000 today, $13,000 US in 2026. There were some rather more expensive suites here, but we'll come back to those in a minute. A-Deck and the Boat Deck had some really unusual, kind of special cabins for first class that are some of my favourites on the ship. These 2 decks were mostly dedicated to the first class public rooms, but White Star Line squeezed in a few odd staterooms here and there. Up on A-Deck, there was a whole block of them, up forward in a very convenient spot close to the grand staircase. But these didn't look directly out into the ocean. Instead, they featured frosted windows that looked into the promenade deck. And they still didn't have their own bathrooms. Still, they'd set you back £70 for that prime real estate. £7,000 today, or just shy of $10,000 US. Then there were 2 nice little cabins nestled in either side of the after grand staircase. Designer Thomas Andrews travelled in one of these. They featured their own toilet and bath, and they sat in a prime location, but because they were such a late addition to the ship, their actual cost for the voyage is unknown. You might have been looking at something like £110, that's £11,200 today, or $15,000 US, if we follow the logic of taking a cabin with a bathroom from the deck below and adding £10 to the cost. So far, we've travelled up the ladder from £8 third-class cabins to £245 suites, but Titanic had an extra special pair of accommodations which were truly the creme de la creme. These were the private promenade suites on B-Deck, essentially your own private apartment at sea, the ones supposedly occupied by Rose and her fiancé Cal in the 1997 movie. They were made up of 2 bedrooms, one in either Empire or Italian Renaissance style, and the other in Harland and Wolff's own modern French style, a sitting room in either Adam or Louis XVI styles, a bath, a toilet, 2 wardrobes, and a private veranda-style promenade finished with Tudor details. The promenade alone was about the floor space of 4 first-class cabins all by itself. This little setup would have cost you up to £660. That's $90,000 in the wintertime and $118,000 in the summertime in 2026 money. That comes in at almost $20,000 per day on board. Now, look, there was clearly a huge disparity in wealth back then. Just one of those parlour suites cost as much as 90 third-class fares alone. It's a staggering sum, even by today's standards, and amazingly, although one of those suites was occupied by White Star chairman Bruce Ismay, the other did have a fare-paying passenger in it. Mrs. Charlotte Cardeza boarded Titanic with her son and her maid, along with 14 steamer trunks, suitcases, and 3 crates of baggage. Queen Mary 2 has her own luxury suites that are about some of the nicest you'll find at sea today, but they are priced well short of the luxurious parlour suites on board Titanic. Now, that's not to say they won't set you back a good deal. That'll be $36,000 thanks. But there are still 5 more unique suites that look out over the stern. They're bigger, they're about 2,200 square feet. The grand duplexes cost $41,000. That's £31,000. It's not just about all that beautiful space either. The duplexes come with their own butler, canapes served right before dinner each night, a fully stocked office, and a catered soiree where occupants can invite senior officers and the captain to refreshments in their suite. I guess the reason these apartments at sea are priced lower by almost half than those on Titanic is because back then, in Titanic's day, it was the only way to get across the ocean. Meanwhile today, the ultra-wealthy will fly in their own private jets across the Atlantic, meaning demand for super luxury suites on ships like Queen Mary 2 isn't the same as those aboard Titanic might have been. The first-class passenger list from Titanic, if she sailed today, and passenger aircraft didn't exist, would likely include people like Bill Gates, Taylor Swift, bet you never expected me to mention her in an Oceanliner Designs video, but here we are, and Michael Jordan. They would all, of course, be perfectly happy and willing to fork out $90,000 for the best of the best. Today on Queen Mary 2, people are travelling for fun in a standard of comfort far superior to anything aboard Titanic, but for significantly less. So, there you have it. A lot of this is really possible thanks to the researchers from Encyclopedia Titanica, especially Thomas Crom, who used ticketing agents' plans to map out the costs of individual staterooms. So well done everybody over there, and thank you, Thomas. Travel aboard Titanic was certainly not cheap, even for third-class passengers who would have saved for months and months, years even, just to get their shot to travel west to the New World. So, if I were your booking agent, which cabin would I be booking for you? Or if cost were no issue, which cabin would you like to book most of all? Let me know down in the comments. You'd have found me in one of those neat little cabins either side of the staircase on A deck, if money were no issue. Otherwise, you'd probably have found me down in the bottom of the ship somewhere. But hey, at least we can throw a real party, right?